Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about a couple things. So firstly, talk about the debate, policy questions over international trade, then think about some things with tariffs and protectionism, and then think about globalization. Now the kind of in terms of like quantitatively and with graphs, the important part of this lecture is thinking about like the graph for when a tariff is imposed. And I'll link up the other video that I've got, or if you search on if you go to my YouTube and then search, you'll find the video that I've got for the effect of tariffs, and that I'll go through really carefully about how a tariff affects buyers, sellers, and then kind of different levels of the economy, or different levels of market participants in that particular market. Here, there's also sort of a qualitative contribution, which is like thinking about these arguments for limiting trade, for instance. So there's some arguments for limiting trade. Firstly, national security argument. So national security requires we produce strategically important goods ourselves. Well, it takes on a different significance during pandemic, right? So thinking about having access to PPE and other sorts of important things. Argument part two, or number two, so protection can help infant industries develop, right? Part three, anti-dumping laws prevent unfair competition. 4, trade should not be a way to skirt regulations. 5, foreign competition may lead to job losses, right? All right, so the first one, national security requires we produce strategically important goods ourselves. I mean, it's pretty much what it says, which is like, hey, look, if you're gonna be in an emergency, whether it's like a war or whether it's like pandemic or something like this, where all of a sudden there's a national emergency, you want to at least you want to be able to produce what you need domestically. So that's that argument. The infant industries argument is kind of on the other hand. It's like you want to limit trade into particular areas. This is usually to protect like the developing world. So the idea would be, okay, we've got developing economies. They're starting to produce in some particular industry. So we should block entry and block trade in that industry so that those companies are allowed to develop and then hopefully thrive without competition from much more developed countries that is, seemingly unfair. And the idea here is really a long run view, which is that if we block trade, then these infant industries are going to develop and are going to be sort of important engines for economic growth in that particular region. So there's like a competing societal goal as well. Anti-dumping laws prevent unfair competition. Anti-dumping laws would be like to prevent companies from flooding an economy with cheap products. Like if you overproduce and you're not able to sell them all in one country, you sell them really cheaply in another country, which on the one hand is good because then you're able to access the product much more cheaply there. On the other hand, that's bad because that's really unfair to competition in that economy. And so an anti-dumping law prevents that from happening. Trade should not be a way to skirt regulations. Think of it like environmental regulations. So, okay, you can't do this nasty production process here. So maybe you go and trade for the product from another country where they don't have the same protections. Well, this is saying, well, maybe we don't want trade to be a way to get away from these regulations. So that's the idea. And then foreign competition may lead to job losses. Oh, here's the picture. So unemployment's not related to imports. Each point is showing imports and unemployment for a separate country. So there's a bunch of countries. Here's the US right here. Here's the unemployment rate. Here's the share of income spent on imports. And so there's not a clear relationship between imports and unemployment, right? So think of like drawing, this is a scatter plot. Think of drawing a line, like a correlation. There's not a relationship. One of the reasons why is because imports, countries that have such a great demand for products that they're unable to satisfy that demand locally will import. And if that's the case, you also tend to have demand for workers making other products and then being able to buy. So it's a lot of different kind of things related. All right, intuitive approach to the international trade debate. So there's two ways to get cars. Well, you could make cars in the United States, or you could harvest corn and then export it overseas in exchange for cars, right? So like if you want to buy cars from another country, well, you could first make corn and then buy cars. So here's the two ways to make cars. Here's one way, and then here's the other way, right? Which way's better? The better way is whichever way allows you to produce at the lowest opportunity cost. All right, so there's 5 main arguments people give for limiting international trade. Debate is best when informed by applying the notion of comparative advantage, right? You have a comparative advantage when you give up the least, when you have the smallest opportunity cost in producing whatever is the product. All right, practice question, provide 2 arguments for limiting trade. Explain how economists have criticized each of the arguments. Well, all right, so we have the arguments back here, right? I actually didn't give the criticism. I kind of tried to explain them a little bit. I don't know. I mean, the key kind of criticism is that they ignore comparative advantage, right? All right. So understand how and why governments shape international policy. So we have tariffs, we have sort of bureaucracy, we have import quotas, we have exchange rate manipulation, we have free trade. All right. So tariff is a tax on imported products. Tariffs increase the trade price of a good. So we can use the supply and demand model. So here's basically the idea. So here's kind of the picture. We have domestic demand, we have domestic supply. We initially had the world price. Now there's a tariff attached onto the world price. So it's the world price plus a tariff. And now we can think about like what happens to consumer and producer surplus. Well, when we're just looking at the blue and the red line and there's no international trade, then consumer surplus is A plus B plus not when there's no international trade, when there's trade but no tariff. Then consumer surplus involves like all the gains from imports that we saw in the picture in the previous lecture. So it's A, B, C, D, E, F. Producer surplus is just area G. And what's happened is if the world price is $12, remember the vertical height of the supply curve is the cost to sellers. So this means like all those sellers from this dot up to this dot and then up to here and along here, all these domestic sellers, their marginal costs are higher than the world price. So they're being undercut by more efficient foreign producers. Their opportunity costs are way too high. Now these producers right here, their opportunity cost is lower, or their marginal cost is lower, so they're able to produce and be profitable. But then what domestic producers ask for is for a tariff. Let's raise this $4. And what that does is that allows these domestic sellers, corresponding to what's labeled as area D, now their costs are above $12, but below $16. So now they're able to produce and be profitable, and that allows domestic producer surplus to jump from G to now GC. Now still, the domestic sellers right here, corresponding to area B, they're not able to produce because they're still undercut at the price of $16. So that doesn't happen. Actually, the domestic quantity supplied here is going to be whatever this is. And then the domestic quantity demanded at $16 is going to be right here. So imports with the tariff are going to correspond to this distance. That's just area E. Area E is actually the revenue from the tariff, right? The tariff is a tax of $4 on imports. So it's going to be the price, $4 times the amount times the quantity. That's just the area of a rectangle. Whoops. Area F is going to be deadweight loss. This is going to be inefficiency because this is foregone consumption. The domestic demand curve lies above the world price, meaning consumers value these goods more highly than they cost to produce. But nevertheless, those trades don't happen because the actual price is going to be $16, meaning, yeah, you value the good at like $15, but we're going to sell it at $16. So you're not going to buy. And so these individuals are kind of kicked out of the market. Over here, area D, this is like deadweight loss. It's inefficiency that's entering because you're voluntarily paying too much, right? So here's the cost. This is like this is productive inefficiency because here's these domestic suppliers, by virtue of the supply curve, their marginal cost lying vertically higher than the world price tells us here these costs are higher than the world costs. Why would you want to sell? Why would you want to favor the higher cost producer? Well, if you do, then you're incurring costs that are higher than are necessary. And so that's inefficient. So that's what area D is. It's losses. These are gains that could go to consumer surplus if consumers were able to buy at the price of $12. All right, so this is kind of summarizing in this table here. All right, so red tape is similar to tariff in that it raises trade costs, doesn't raise government revenue. So it's basically just effectively raising the price by virtue of just making things more difficult, just like raising trade costs due to bureaucracy. A quota is a limit on the quantity of the good that can be imported. There's a similar effect to a tariff, but doesn't raise government revenue because now you're limiting what's the quantity that can be brought into the market. Current state of U.S. trade policy, so as of 2018, so largely embraces free trade. Use of tariff is lower today than it was in the past. Still protects some industries such as agriculture. We see overall the U.S. is, well, more positioned towards free trade than at previous times. So, comparing tariff rates, well, the U.S. is involved in many trade agreements. Most large economies have low tariff rates. Here's the U.S., which is low relative to the rest of the world, so no tariffs would be here. High tariffs would be at the top. Okay, good. So review of trade policy, tariffs, bureaucracy, quotas are common tools of production or protection. Each reduces welfare. The latter two do not raise government revenue. How do you get government revenue? Well, taxes. So tariffs raise revenue because it is a tax on imports. Tariffs in the U.S. and other large economies tend to be low relative actually to the past and to other smaller economies. There are some protected industries. We talked about agriculture, for instance. All right, thinking about globalization, this is an application of the interdependence principle, right? So think about the labor market. Well, laborers do not directly compete, but their labor competes, right? Their labor is embodied in the goods and services traded between countries. And so in that sense, there's a sort of indirect competition between workers. Productivity determines wages. So will globalization drive down wages in the United States? Well, this won't happen anytime soon based on relative productivity, and employers set wages based on productivity. Productivity is important because that's what's generating economic value. And U.S. has really high wages and has higher productivity. Look at this scatter plot, right? You could see like high wages and high productivity is going to be correlated because, well, we're expecting productivity is the key determinant both of wages but then also of standard of living. All right, international trade and income inequality. Well, globalization increases income inequality. High-skilled American workers are in demand because of the stuff they make. Low-skilled workers are in abundance around the world, and the goods that they make are exported by many countries. Why? Well, the default, the status quo, is to have low skills, and so it takes kind of really expensive structural investment to get high skill, and so that's why there's a premium associated with high skill workers. And I mean, the fact that we make human capital investments in experience and education is driven by the fact that there's increasing rewards to skills. Although this drives up an income gap between the high-skilled and low-skilled workers in the U.S. and then elsewhere. So then there's some questions about how to deal with the resulting income inequality. And that's a major policy decision or policy debate. What are your thoughts on fair trade versus free trade? To think really carefully what we mean by fair trade. Think of fair trade specifically as the system that involves providing worker protections and sort of reinvesting in the local economy. There's a whole lot of things that go into like the fair trade movement. Free trade is, by free trade we typically mean just like no barriers besides natural barriers to trade. All right, so trade's ultimately about cooperation, not competition. We shouldn't think about trade as zero sum because it's not. People trade, countries don't trade. Trade's not just about business. Consumers are really important, especially because consumers are workers and consumers are buyers, and ultimately we have to realize that the effects are on people, right? All right, trade is an opportunity. Trade can also be a threat. and trade certainly can cause short-term disruptions. All right, so I'll go ahead and conclude here. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next.